teach him to ignore MY rules.
Karen guns the semi-truck straight into my grandfather's 1943 mailbox, smashing 80 years of family history into twisted scrap. She's screaming victory from the cab, pumping her fist, honking the horn like she just conquered the world. She thinks she won the neighborhood war. What Karen doesn't know, she just smashed a World War II veterans memorial. I'm not even in her HOA, and everything was caught on camera. Now Karen's victory dance is happening while she's trapped in a truck she can't control. Engine smoking, hydraulic fluid everywhere, celebrating the destruction of an innocent family's most precious possession. She thinks she taught me about community compliance. What she actually did was destroy a war hero's legacy and hand me everything I need to ruin her life. What would you do if someone celebrated smashing your family's most precious possession? Where are you watching from? Because Karen's victory party is about to become her worst nightmare. 6 months ago, inheriting my grandfather's 1943 farmhouse felt like a gift from heaven. After my divorce dragged on for 2 years in Portland, I needed somewhere quiet to rebuild my life. This place, 2.3 acres of what used to be farmland, seemed perfect. Dominic Delacroix, that's me. 52, professional land surveyor, and completely unprepared for the nightmare waiting in my new neighborhood. The house still carries the scent of old cedar and linseed oil from when my grandfather built these walls with his own hands. Every morning, I drink coffee on the same wraparound porch where he used to sit after returning from Normandy with shrapnel in his leg and stories he never told. His hand-painted mailbox, bright blue with white hand-lettered numbers, stands like a proud memorial at the end of our gravel drive. That mailbox meant everything to him. "A man's home starts at the street," he used to say, touching up the paint every spring until arthritis made the brush too heavy to hold. Everything was peaceful until September, when Karen Delgado arrived like a one-woman occupying force. Picture this: white Escalade, blonde highlights, clipboard gripped like a legal weapon. She clicked up my front steps in designer heels, surveying my property with the cold calculation of someone who'd never heard the word no in her entire life. "President Delgado, Willowbrook Estates, HOA," she announced without pleasantries. "We need to discuss your numerous violations immediately." She rattled off her list with prosecutorial precision. Chicken coop was a disease vector, vegetable garden attracted vermin and rodents. My grandfather's hand-painted mailbox was aesthetically incompatible with established community standards. The morning air grew colder with each word. "Ma'am, this property predates your HOA by 60 years, I explained politely. "We're not subject to your covenants." Karen's perfectly made-up face shifted like storm clouds gathering before a tornado. "Every property in this area follows our rules. Every single one, no exceptions." The creak of my porch swing seemed to irritate her as much as my very existence. That same afternoon, my phone rang. County code enforcement, responding to complaints about illegal agricultural operations and public nuisance violations. The bitter taste of panic mixed with my evening coffee as I realized Karen's threats weren't empty posturing. $800 in attorney consultation fees confirmed what I already suspected. Every complaint was frivolous, designed purely to harass. But that was just Karen's opening move. 2 weeks later, she organized an emergency HOA meeting featuring a 40-slide presentation with telephoto photos of my property. 60 neighbors crammed into the community center while Karen painted me as a neighborhood menace threatening everyone's property values. The smell of stale coffee and fear hung heavy in the fluorescent-lit room. "This individual refuses to comply with established community standards," Karen declared, clicking through images of my tomato plants like they were crime scene photos. "We cannot allow this dangerous precedent to contaminate our neighborhood." The motion passed unanimously. All adjacent properties must comply with HOA standards or face escalated community enforcement actions. That night, my security cameras caught Karen's first real crime. She crept onto my property at 2 a.m. and spray-painted "Violator" across my grandfather's memorial mailbox in dripping red letters. The footage was crystal clear: her face, her license plate, her complete disregard for the law. But here's what really chilled me. When I filed the police report, 3 different neighbors quietly pulled me aside. "She did the same thing to the Hendersons before they moved away," Mrs. Elise whispered, looking over her shoulder. "Started with complaints, escalated to vandalism, ended with them selling at a loss just to escape her. The smell of autumn leaves burning couldn't mask the scent of fear that had settled over our entire street. Karen had trained 60 families to live in terror of her clipboard and her vindictive enforcement campaigns. What Karen didn't know was that she'd just picked a fight with someone who documents everything, understands property law better than most attorneys, and has absolutely nothing left to lose. My grandfather survived Normandy. I was about to show Karen what his grandson learned about fighting back. Karen's spray-painted violator across my grandfather's mailbox was still wet when I made my first move. Most people would have called the police and hoped for the best, but 30 years as a land surveyor taught me that hope isn't a strategy, documentation is. By 6 a.m., I had high-resolution photos from 6 angles, time-stamped security footage showing Karen's face and license plate, and paint samples scraped into evidence bags. The metallic scratch of my utility knife against dried paint echoed in the crisp morning air as I methodically built my case. The smell of coffee mixed with spray paint fumes as I uploaded everything to my computer. My grandfather always said, "Measure twice, cut once." I was about to show Karen what that philosophy looked like in a property war. 3 days later, Karen escalated with another emergency HOA meeting, this time targeting me specifically. 60 neighbors packed the clubhouse while she stood at the podium like a prosecutor presenting to a grand jury. "This individual has resorted to surveillance and intimidation tactics," she announced, pointing at a blown-up photo of my security camera. "Recording board members during official business constitutes harassment of elected officials." The crowd shifted nervously. Karen had mastered the art of weaponizing their fear. Furthermore, she clicked to her next slide, "County records indicate structures on this property predate current safety codes. I'm recommending immediate inspection for compliance violations." That's when Karen made her first critical error. She demanded I provide documentation proving my chicken coop met modern agricultural regulations for residential zones. Here's something I learned during 3 decades of surveying disputes. When someone starts inventing regulations that don't exist, they're usually desperate. Agricultural codes don't apply to residential chicken coops, and modern regulations can't retroactively invalidate grandfathered structures. Karen was basically demanding I prove compliance with laws that never existed. I waited until she finished her performance, then stood slowly. The room went dead silent except for fluorescent lights humming overhead. "Mrs. Delgado, you just cited agricultural regulations that don't apply to residential properties. You also demanded documentation for structures explicitly protected under state heritage laws." Karen's face flushed crimson. "Are you questioning this board's authority?" "I'm stating facts about property law, something you might research before your next presentation." The bitter taste of confrontation hung in the air as neighbors exchanged glances. Some looked intrigued, others terrified. Karen's retaliation came the next morning, a certified letter claiming my vegetable garden violated residential zoning ordinances and demanding I cease all agricultural activities immediately or face legal action. That letter was mistake number 2. I spent 4 hours in the county planning office surrounded by dusty files and the musty smell of decades-old paperwork. What I discovered was pure gold, a 1943 agricultural exemption specifically protecting existing farming operations on properties predating residential development. My vegetable garden wasn't just legal, it was legally bulletproof against exactly the harassment Karen was attempting. Sometimes the best defense is paperwork older than your enemy. Armed with this ammunition, I crafted my counterstrike. Instead of responding directly to Karen, I sent copies to every HOA board member, the county planning department, and the State Attorney General's Homeowner Association Oversight Division. My letter was surgical. I cited the specific exemption, included historical documentation, and noted that Karen's attempts to enforce non-existent regulations constituted harassment under state law. I also filed a formal complaint alleging abuse of authority and harassment of non-members. The sweet sound of Karen's phone ringing at 8 a.m. Friday morning was music to my ears. I couldn't hear the state investigator's words, but Karen's voice climbing several octaves told me everything I needed to know. By noon, she was pacing her front porch, screaming into her phone about government overreach and biased investigations. The autumn air carried her shrill complaints across the entire neighborhood. That afternoon brought the week's highlight. Karen's Escalade screeched into my driveway, and she burst out clutching papers like they were burning her hands. "You think you're so smart," she yelled, storming toward my porch. Hiding behind technicalities and government bureaucrats? I sipped my coffee calmly. Karen, I'm not hiding behind anything. I'm standing on my own property, protected by laws that existed before you were born. Her face went from red to purple. This isn't over. I don't care what some dusty old papers say. This neighborhood has standards. She stomped back to her car, slamming the door so hard the entire vehicle shook. But in her rage, Karen made mistake number 3, the one that would eventually destroy her. I'll find a way to get rid of you permanently, she screamed, loud enough for the whole street to hear. Mrs. Elise was watering her garden. The Rodriguezes were washing their car. Old Mr. Patterson looked up from his newspaper. Half a dozen neighbors witnessed Karen making a direct threat while already under state investigation. The taste of victory mixed perfectly with my evening coffee as I watched Karen's Escalade disappear around the corner, trailing fury and the distinct smell of burnt rubber. Karen's public threat should have been her surrender. Instead, she doubled down like a gambler, betting her house on a losing hand. 2 weeks later, Inspector Rodriguez from City Planning knocked on my door with a puzzled expression and a thick file folder. Someone had filed an elaborate complaint claiming I was illegally subdividing property for commercial rental and operating an unlicensed agricultural business. Sir, I've been doing this for 15 years, he said, shaking his head. This complaint reads like someone Googled zoning violations and threw everything at the wall to see what stuck. I walked him around the property while he photographed my tomato plants and measured absolutely nothing. The morning air carried the scent of fresh coffee and Rodriguez's growing frustration as he documented perfectly legal activities. Sharing vegetables with neighbors isn't commercial agriculture, he muttered, making notes. And there's definitely no subdivision happening here. Whoever filed this either doesn't understand zoning law or thinks we're idiots. Before leaving, he handed me the complaint. Karen's signature sprawled across the bottom like a confession, complete with a 3-page narrative describing my illegal farm operation and unpermitted rental units that existed only in her imagination. The bitter taste of her desperation was almost as satisfying as my morning coffee. But while Karen was busy inventing violations, I was doing what I do best: research. Property records don't lie, and 30 years of surveying taught me exactly where to look for the truth. What I found was beautiful in its irony. Karen's pristine house had a dirty little secret hiding in plain sight. Her deck, the one she'd built in 2019, extended 18 inches beyond the legal setback line. Even better, her building permits told a fascinating story. She'd applied for a 12 by 16 deck, but constructed a 14 by 18 structure without filing amendments. Every surveyor knows this trick. Apply for a smaller project to get quick approval, then build bigger and hope nobody measures. It works until someone like me shows up with actual measuring equipment and a grudge. The musty smell of old paperwork in the records office couldn't hide my satisfaction as I photographed every document. Karen was citing codes against me while actively violating the same regulations on her own property. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor. I filed my counter-complaint that afternoon, complete with photos showing her oversized deck and copies of the original permits. City planning takes unpermitted construction seriously. It affects property taxes, insurance liability, and structural safety. Karen was about to discover that harassment has consequences. Her retaliation came at 3 a.m. Saturday morning. My security cameras captured Karen creeping across my lawn like a suburban commando, spray can in one hand, pen-light clenched between her teeth. This time she used fluorescent orange paint that glowed like a traffic cone in the dawn light. But desperation makes people sloppy. The paint came from Karen's own garage, the same fluorescent orange from her recent deck project. The empty can sat in her recycling bin like evidence at a crime scene, visible to anyone walking past. Officer Martinez responded to my police report with the weary expression of someone who'd seen this movie before. He reviewed the footage, examined the paint evidence, and sighed. "Ma'am, this is clearly repeat harassment from the same individual. We're issuing a citation and recommending the prosecutor file formal charges." The sweet sound of Karen's doorbell at 7 a.m. Monday morning announced the citation's arrival. Her shriek of outrage echoed across 3 houses, followed by frantic phone calls about police corruption and selective enforcement. That afternoon delivered my favorite plot twist yet. A city inspector appeared at Karen's door with his own clipboard, there to examine her unpermitted deck modifications. I watched from my porch as Karen tried explaining why her deck was bigger than approved, her voice climbing octaves with each question. "Ma'am, the structure clearly exceeds permitted dimensions," Inspector Williams explained patiently. "You'll need to either remove the excess or file for amended permits plus penalties." Karen's face cycled through an impressive color spectrum as reality hit. Her harassment campaign had boomeranged directly into her own violations. The crunch of gravel under Williams's boots as he measured her illegal deck was music to my ears. But Wednesday evening brought something that made my blood run cold. Mrs. Elise called, her voice tight with worry. "You need to see what's happening at Karen's house." I walked to my driveway and felt my stomach drop. A semi-truck sat in Karen's driveway, diesel engine rumbling like a caged beast. Karen gestured wildly while talking to the driver, pointing repeatedly toward my property. The acrid smell of exhaust mixed with my growing dread as she shook hands with the trucker. Whatever Karen was planning required 18 tons of steel and someone desperate enough to help her. My grandfather survived Normandy by recognizing when the enemy was about to do something stupid and dangerous. As that diesel engine revved louder in the evening air, I realized Karen had just crossed the line from harassment into something much more serious. The semi-truck disappeared from Karen's driveway Thursday morning, but the acrid smell of diesel exhaust clung to the air like a threat that wouldn't dissipate. Friday brought Karen's most audacious scheme yet, a professional surveyor appearing at my door with expensive equipment and a very specific agenda. "Mr. Delacroix?" "Brad Sullivan from Precision Land Services," he said, nervously adjusting his hard hat. "I'm here about an encroachment issue." I recognized Sullivan's type immediately, young, ambitious, and flexible with ethics when the price was right. Morning sunlight glinted off his transit equipment as he unpacked instruments worth more than most people's annual salary. "Your fence allegedly crosses 6 inches onto HOA common property," Sullivan explained, consulting notes that looked suspiciously coached. "My client wants documentation before pursuing legal remedies." The irony was delicious. Karen had hired a surveyor to challenge another surveyor on his own property. It was like challenging Mozart to a piano competition using a toy keyboard. I watched Sullivan work, immediately spotting the red flags. He was using a utility marker from 1987 as his reference point instead of the original 1943 survey monument, a mistake so basic it would get you laughed out of any serious surveying firm. "Shouldn't you reference the original property markers?" I suggested. Sullivan waved me off dismissively. "Modern GPS is more accurate than those old concrete chunks." That's when I knew Karen had found herself a surveyor willing to deliver the results she'd already paid for. We call this surveying to the contract, making measurements match the client's desires rather than reality. But Sullivan had made one catastrophic error. He assumed I wouldn't know enough to challenge his work. That afternoon, I retrieved my own surveying equipment from storage. The familiar weight of instruments I'd used for 30 years felt like strapping on armor for battle. The precise click of adjustment settings and the smooth operation of well-maintained equipment reminded me why I'd never lost a property dispute in 3 decades. What I discovered was pure gold. Sullivan hadn't just used the wrong reference point. He'd used a marker that was 12 feet off from the true property line. Following the correct 1943 survey monuments, my fence wasn't encroaching on HOA land. The HOA common area was encroaching 3 feet onto my property. Karen had paid premium rates for a survey that proved the exact opposite of what she wanted. Sometimes incompetence is its own punishment, but the story got even better. Tuesday morning brought Frank Patterson, now 86 but still sharp as his surveying tools. His firm had set the original 1943 monuments, and he'd personally worked with my grandfather on the boundary survey. Harold was particular about precision, Frank said, running weathered hands over the concrete monument. He made us set these markers deeper than code required because he said this land would outlast everyone who tried to steal it. The smell of fresh earth and old concrete filled the morning air as Frank verified what I already knew. The original survey was bulletproof, and Sullivan's work was garbage masquerading as expertise. Armed with devastating evidence, I filed a complaint against Sullivan with the state licensing board for gross negligence and fraudulent surveying practices. In our profession, using wrong reference points isn't just sloppy, it's career-ending. Karen's retaliation came that evening in the form of a community emergency meeting. She packed 60 neighbors into the clubhouse, projecting Sullivan's flawed measurements like they were holy scripture. This individual has stolen HOA property for decades, Karen declared, her voice rising to evangelical fervor. We're talking thousands in legal fees to reclaim our land from this thief. The crowd rumbled with anger. Property theft strikes at the heart of suburban anxiety, and Karen had painted me as a criminal who'd been robbing the community blind. But Karen's theatrical performance contained one fatal flaw. She'd invited the wrong audience. Bob Martinez, retired structural engineer, raised his hand during Karen's presentation. How do we verify this survey's accuracy? What reference standards did they use? Karen fumbled through Sullivan's report like someone reading a foreign language. They used modern technology, GPS, much more precise than those old marker things. Martinez's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. Ma'am, those old marker things are the legal foundation for every property line in this development. Any survey ignoring them is worthless. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as neighbors realized Karen might be selling them expensive lies wrapped in professional packaging. But Thursday evening brought something that made my blood freeze. Through my kitchen window, I watched Karen pacing her driveway while making increasingly frantic phone calls. The autumn wind carried fragments of her conversation across the street. Final solution. And heavy equipment. And this weekend for sure. Her gestures toward my property grew more violent with each call. Whatever she was planning involved machinery capable of permanent destruction and someone desperate enough to operate it for her. The smell of burning leaves couldn't mask the scent of Karen's desperation turning into something far more dangerous. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that makes you believe anything is possible. I was enjoying coffee on my porch when Karen's white Escalade pulled into my driveway with the aggressive confidence of someone who thinks they're about to deliver a killing blow. She stepped out clutching a manila folder like it contained nuclear launch codes, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Behind her emerged a man in an expensive suit, clearly an attorney she'd hired to make this moment official. Dominic Delacroix, Karen announced, her voice carrying the theatrical authority of someone who'd rehearsed this scene. I'm here to serve you with formal notice of HOA covenant violations and immediate compliance demands. The attorney, a thin, nervous type who kept checking his phone, handed me a thick document packet. Sir, you're being notified of multiple violations of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association covenants, bylaws, and architectural guidelines. I accepted the papers calmly, scanning the cover letter while sipping my coffee. The morning air carried the scent of autumn leaves and Karen's expensive perfume as she waited for my reaction. Additionally, Karen continued, her voice rising with excitement, you're being assessed emergency fines totaling $12,000 for ongoing violations, plus attorney fees. Payment is due within 30 days, or we'll place a lien on your property. She was practically vibrating with anticipation, like a cat who'd cornered a mouse and was ready to play with it before the kill. That's when I looked up from the papers and smiled. Karen, there's something I need to show you. I walked inside and returned with my own manila folder, one I'd been keeping for exactly this moment. The attorney shifted uncomfortably as I opened it on my porch railing. This is the original 1943 property deed, I said calmly, pointing to the yellowed document. And this is the 1987 Willowbrook Estates Development Plat Map. Karen leaned forward, her confidence wavering as she tried to process what she was seeing. Notice anything interesting about the boundaries? I continued, enjoying every second. My property, all 2.3 acres of it, predates your development by 60 years. It was specifically excluded from the HOA covenant when your subdivision was built. The attorney's face went pale as he examined the documents. Ma'am, this property appears to be legally separate from the HOA jurisdiction. Karen's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the color draining from her face. That's impossible. Everyone in this area has to follow our rules. Everyone. Here's the subdivision agreement from 1987, I continued, pulling out another document. See section 4.2, quote, pre-existing agricultural properties shall retain grandfathered status and remain exempt from all HOA covenants, bylaws, and assessments. The manila folder slipped from Karen's hands, papers scattering across my porch as the reality hit her like a physical blow. You're telling me, her voice cracked, you're not in our HOA? Never was. Never signed anything. Never agreed to any of your rules. My grandfather built this house before your neighborhood existed. Karen's legs seemed to give out slightly, and she grabbed the porch railing for support. The attorney was frantically shuffling through his papers, probably calculating how many billable hours he'd just wasted. But you have to follow the rules, Karen whispered, her voice barely audible. How can you not be in the HOA? How is that possible? The beautiful irony wasn't lost on me. For 6 months, Karen had been harassing, vandalizing, and threatening someone who was completely outside her jurisdiction. Every complaint, every fine, every legal threat had been based on authority she never possessed. Karen, I said gently, every single thing you've done to me for the past 6 months has been illegal harassment of a private citizen who never agreed to your authority. That's when Karen Delgado, HOA president and neighborhood dictator, completely snapped. The scream that came out of her mouth could have shattered glass. Karen's scream still rang in my ears 3 hours later, but it was the look in her eyes that kept me awake that night. I'd seen that expression once before, on a property owner in Oregon who'd lost a boundary dispute and decided if he couldn't have his land, nobody could. That man had burned down 3 houses before the police stopped him. Sunday morning brought an emergency neighborhood meeting, but this time I was the one calling it. 8 families gathered in my living room, coffee cups balanced on nervous knees as I explained what we were really dealing with. Karen isn't just angry, I said, showing them security footage of her 3 a.m. vandalism sprees. She's having a psychological breakdown, and people in her condition don't make rational decisions. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the tension as neighbors exchanged worried glances. These weren't activists. They were regular families who just wanted to live peacefully without fear. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" asked Bob Martinez, the retired engineer who'd challenged Karen's survey. "Be witnesses," I replied simply. "Karen's planning something big, and when she makes her move, I need people around who can call police and testify about what they saw." Mrs. Elise leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "She drove by my house 6 times yesterday, taking pictures of my garden. I'm scared she'll target me next for helping you." That's when I realized this wasn't just about protecting my property anymore. Karen had terrorized an entire neighborhood into submission, and someone needed to break that cycle of fear. "Here's what we're going to do," I said, pulling out a hand-drawn map of our street. "Everyone gets my cell number and Dave Richardson's attorney contact. If Karen shows up with any kind of equipment or starts threatening anyone, we activate a phone tree that brings witnesses and police simultaneously." The planning session revealed something beautiful. Once people stopped being afraid, they got angry. Really angry. "She made my daughter cry last month," admitted Sarah Rodriguez. "Told her our Halloween decorations were inappropriate for a quality neighborhood." "She called code enforcement on my elderly mother's wheelchair ramp," added Jim Patterson. "Claimed it was an unauthorized structure." By the end of the meeting, I had 8 families committed to what we started calling Operation Spotlight, making sure Karen's next move happened in front of as many witnesses as possible. But Karen's threat required more than community support. It required engineering. Monday through Wednesday, I rebuilt my mailbox with the obsessive precision of someone whose life might depend on it. The old wooden post got replaced with a steel I-beam salvaged from a demolished bridge, 6 inches in diameter, designed to support highway overpasses. The foundation hole went 4 feet deep, wider at the bottom than the top to prevent any possibility of pulling it out. I mixed the concrete with extra Portland cement and fiber reinforcement, creating a foundation that could anchor a small building. Here's what 30 years of surveying teaches you about permanent installations. Depth matters more than width, steel beats everything, and proper anchoring is the difference between a structure and a projectile. That mailbox post could withstand a Category 5 hurricane or a very angry woman with heavy equipment. The mailbox itself became a work of tactical art. Marine-grade aluminum housing, reinforced door hinges, and a locking mechanism that required a key. I positioned the entire structure exactly 6 inches inside my property line, legally bulletproof and practically indestructible. Thursday brought my secret weapon, Dave Richardson's legal trap. "We're not filing anything yet," Dave explained as we reviewed the paperwork in his office. "But I've prepared an emergency injunction, harassment lawsuit, and criminal complaint forms. The moment Karen crosses the line, we hit her with everything simultaneously." The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Let Karen commit her next crime in full view of witnesses, then bury her in legal consequences so severe she'd never recover. Civil lawsuits take time, but restraining order violations mean immediate jail time. What if she doesn't take the bait? I asked. Dave smiled grimly. Dominic, people like Karen can't help themselves. She's been the neighborhood dictator for years, and you just proved she has no real authority. Her ego won't let her walk away. Friday evening, I conducted final preparations with the methodical care of someone planning a military operation. Security cameras positioned to cover every approach angle. Motion sensors linked to smartphone alerts, emergency contact numbers programmed for one-touch dialing. The October air carried the scent of wood smoke from neighboring fireplaces as I tested each system one final time. Everything worked perfectly. Standing in my driveway, looking at my fortress mailbox gleaming under the streetlight, I felt the same satisfaction my grandfather must have experienced after completing a challenging survey. Every measurement was precise, every angle calculated, every contingency planned for. Tomorrow was Saturday. If Karen was planning her grand finale, weekend mornings were when she felt most bold. The stage was set. The trap was armed. All that remained was waiting for Karen to demonstrate exactly how far she was willing to go. Saturday brought the smell of death to my backyard. I woke at dawn to Napoleon screeching in distress, not his usual territorial crow, but the sound of a rooster in mortal terror. Through my bedroom window, I saw a figure in dark clothing crouched by my chicken coop, tossing something through the wire mesh. My security cameras captured everything. Karen in black clothes and gloves, methodically spreading blue pellets around the coop while my chickens huddled in panic. The timestamp showed she'd been there for 20 minutes, working with the patient precision of someone who'd planned this carefully. I ran outside in my pajamas, but Karen had vanished like smoke. The chemical smell hit me immediately, antifreeze. She'd scattered antifreeze-soaked corn kernels throughout the coop, enough ethylene glycol to kill every chicken, plus any cats or dogs that wandered into my yard. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was attempted mass murder of innocent animals. My hands shook as I collected the poisoned corn with kitchen tongs, dropping each deadly kernel into evidence bags. Napoleon watched me work with intelligent suspicion, as if he knew something evil had invaded his domain. I moved all 6 chickens to emergency quarters while documenting Karen's crime scene. Detective Sarah Wong arrived within an hour, bringing the grim expertise of someone who'd seen this escalation pattern before. Animal poisoning is a Class D felony, Wong explained while photographing the evidence. But more importantly, it's a reliable predictor of violence against humans. This woman has crossed into dangerous territory. The security footage was damning, Karen's face clearly visible as she committed attempted animal murder. Wong arrested her at 8:30 a.m., leading her away in handcuffs while she screamed about pest control and maintaining property standards. But Karen's bail hearing revealed something that chilled me to the bone. She'd mortgaged her house twice to fund this war against me, first to hire the fraudulent surveyor, then to cover legal fees and bail money. Karen wasn't just desperate, she was financially destroyed and had nothing left to lose. Judge Morrison set bail at $25,000, which Karen couldn't afford. She should have stayed in jail until trial, giving everyone time to cool down and seek rational solutions. Instead, her elderly mother appeared Monday morning with a cashier's check, having apparently remortgaged her own house to free her daughter. Karen was back on the street by noon, more dangerous than ever because now she'd dragged her family into financial ruin. Her next attack targeted something even more precious than my animals, my livelihood. Tuesday's mail brought a letter from the state surveying board that made my coffee turn to acid in my stomach. Karen had filed detailed professional misconduct complaints, alleging I'd falsified measurements, accepted bribes, and violated client confidentiality on dozens of projects. The accusations were elaborate and specific enough to trigger a mandatory investigation. Even though the charges were obviously fabricated, the licensing board had to treat them seriously. My professional credentials, 30 years of spotless reputation, were now under formal review. "She's trying to destroy your ability to make a living," Dave Richardson explained during our emergency meeting. "Even if we eventually prove the allegations false, the investigation process can take 6 months. During that time, most clients won't hire you." But Karen had made a fatal error. Professional misconduct requires evidence, and she'd invented violations that could be easily disproven. Every survey I'd conducted was documented with client testimonials, photographs, and backup measurements from other licensed professionals. I spent Wednesday building my defense. 30 years of satisfied clients, 0 legitimate complaints, and testimony from colleagues who could vouch for my methods and integrity. The counter evidence painted a picture of someone whose professional reputation was bulletproof. Thursday brought Karen's most chilling escalation yet. Mrs. Elise called at twilight, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's back, and she's not alone." I looked through my kitchen window and felt the blood drain from my face. Karen was in Elise's backyard with two men I didn't recognize. Rough-looking guys in work clothes who clearly weren't neighbors. They were measuring distances between properties and pointing repeatedly at my house. One man was taking photos of my security cameras. Another was sketching what looked like approach routes. Karen stood in the center, gesturing animatedly while explaining something that required hand signals and careful planning. This wasn't random vandalism or emotional outburst. This was reconnaissance for a coordinated attack that would require multiple people and specialized equipment. The October air carried the sound of their low voices discussing weekend timing and equipment access. Whatever they were planning needed heavy machinery and the cover of darkness. As they finished their survey and disappeared into the growing dusk, I realized Karen had officially moved beyond individual harassment into something that looked suspiciously like a criminal conspiracy. The war was about to become a battle, and I was outnumbered 3-1. Friday morning brought the sound that would haunt my nightmares, the deep rumble of diesel engines firing up somewhere in the distance. I was drinking coffee on my porch when the noise echoed across the neighborhood, followed by the distinctive hydraulic hiss of heavy machinery warming up. The sound was coming from the direction of the equipment rental facility 3 miles away, and my surveyor's instincts told me this wasn't coincidence. By 10 a.m., my phone was buzzing with messages from the neighborhood watch network we'd established. Bob Martinez had spotted Karen's Escalade at Murphy's Heavy Equipment Rental, followed by Mrs. Elise reporting a semi-truck being loaded with what looked like demolition attachments. "She's rented something big," Bob texted. "Driver looks nervous. Karen looks insane." I activated our emergency plan, sending out the group text that would bring witnesses and police within minutes of Karen's arrival. Then I called Detective Wong, who'd been monitoring Karen since her animal poisoning arrest. "We can't arrest someone for renting equipment," Wong explained, "but we can have patrol units in the area. If she brings that truck onto your property, she's looking at multiple felonies." The waiting was torture. I spent the afternoon double-checking my security cameras, testing the emergency phone tree, and making sure my Fortress mailbox was positioned exactly where the insurance adjuster had photographed it. Everything needed to be legally perfect when Karen made her move. Evening brought an ominous quiet. No diesel engines, no reconnaissance visits, just the normal sounds of a neighborhood settling in for the night, punctuated by the distant rumble of traffic and the rustle of autumn leaves. That's when Karen struck with psychological warfare that was more effective than any physical attack. At 11 p.m., my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw 2 police officers standing on my porch with serious expressions. My stomach dropped as I opened the door, wondering what Karen had accused me of now. "Mr. Delacroix, we received a report that you've been making threatening phone calls to a neighbor," Officer Rodriguez explained. The caller provided recordings of alleged voicemails containing threats of violence. The fabricated evidence was elaborate and professionally edited. Karen had somehow created audio recordings that sounded like me threatening to destroy her property and make her pay for messing with the wrong person. The voice was close enough to mine that it would fool casual listeners. It took 2 hours of reviewing my phone records and demonstrating that the audio was spliced together from different sources before the officers were satisfied I was being framed. But Karen's goal wasn't to get me arrested. It was to exhaust me mentally and legally before her real attack. "She's wearing you down systematically," Dave Richardson observed during our midnight phone call. "First your animals, then your profession, now your freedom. She's eliminating your ability to defend yourself." Saturday dawned gray and cold, with the kind of October sky that promises winter is coming whether you're ready or not. I was on my 3rd cup of coffee when the diesel rumbling started again, closer this time, and growing louder. Mrs. Elise's panicked call came at 8:47 a.m. "She's here! The truck is huge!" I stepped outside and felt my knees nearly buckle. A massive semi-truck was backing down our residential street, hydraulic brakes screaming in protest, as an inexperienced driver tried to maneuver 18 tons of steel through suburban curves designed for minivans. Karen was visible in the passenger seat, gesticulating wildly as she directed the driver toward my property. Her face was flushed with manic excitement, like someone who'd finally found the perfect weapon for a long-delayed execution. The truck was enormous. A standard 18-wheeler with a massive steel bumper that could punch through a brick wall without slowing down. Whatever Karen was planning, it would leave permanent damage. I speed dialed 911 while filming everything on my phone. Heavy equipment trespassing, property destruction in progress, need immediate response. Units are en route, the dispatcher confirmed. Stay away from the vehicle. But Karen wasn't heading for my house or garden. She was lining up the truck with surgical precision, aiming directly at my grandfather's memorial mailbox, the one piece of my property that held the most emotional significance. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on me. Karen thought she was targeting my most vulnerable spot, the one thing whose destruction would break my spirit and prove her dominance over my family's legacy. What she didn't know was that she was about to attack the most heavily fortified mailbox in the continental United States. As the diesel engine revved louder and the truck began its final approach, I realized this was no longer about property disputes or neighborhood politics. This was about a woman so consumed by rage and desperation that she was willing to commit multiple felonies in broad daylight in front of witnesses, with police already en route. Karen had finally crossed the line from harassment into the kind of spectacular self-destruction that would define the rest of her life. The only question was whether my engineering would be strong enough to survive her desperation. The impact sounded like a bomb going off in a scrapyard. Karen's semi-truck hit my grandfather's mailbox at 15 miles per hour, and for one beautiful moment, physics took over from fury. The steel I-beam foundation I'd engineered to survive hurricanes met 18 tons of truck bumper in a collision that sent shockwaves through 3 city blocks. The truck won the first second. My mailbox housing crumpled like aluminum foil, sending a shower of blue paint chips and twisted metal across 50 feet of asphalt. But then the immovable object met the unstoppable force, and the laws of engineering prevailed. The truck's front bumper exploded, the radiator punctured with a geyser of steam and coolant. The cab bounced backward so violently that Karen's head snapped forward into the dashboard, and the driver's door popped open from the impact stress. Karen had expected to demolish a simple mailbox and drive away victorious. Instead, she just destroyed a $40,000 truck against a monument that refused to die. The diesel engine coughed, wheezed, and went silent. Steam billowed from the shattered radiator while hydraulic fluid pooled beneath the chassis like mechanical blood. The smell of burnt rubber, antifreeze, and Karen's complete psychological breakdown filled the morning air. "Oh my God, what happened? How is it still standing?" Karen's voice carried across the entire neighborhood as she struggled out of the disabled truck, her perfect blonde hair now wild with panic. She was screaming at the driver, screaming at my mailbox, screaming at the universe for betraying her moment of triumph. But the beautiful part, the moment I'd been waiting for since this whole war began, was just starting. Police sirens wailed from 4 different directions as our emergency phone tree brought exactly what we'd planned: witnesses, law enforcement, and complete documentation of Karen's spectacular meltdown. Mrs. Elise was filming from her porch. Bob Martinez was recording from his driveway. Even the Rodriguezes had their phones out, capturing Karen's breakdown in glorious high definition. Officer Martinez was first on scene, stepping out of his patrol car with the weary expression of someone who'd been expecting this call. Detective Wong arrived 30 seconds later, followed by a fire truck responding to reports of leaking fluids and possible explosion hazards. "Officers! Officers! This man booby-trapped his mailbox!" Karen shrieked, pointing at the steel post still standing proudly amid the wreckage. "This is attempted murder! He tried to kill me with a mailbox!" Detective Wong examined the destruction with professional interest, taking photos of the truck, the mailbox, and Karen's increasingly frantic explanations. "Ma'am, this appears to be a properly installed mailbox that withstood vehicular assault," Wong observed calmly. "The question is why you drove a commercial vehicle into residential property." That's when Karen completely lost whatever remained of her sanity. "He's not even in the HOA! He's not even in the HOA!" she screamed, as if this explained everything. "He doesn't follow any rules. He can't just ignore community standards." The crowd of neighbors had grown to include 20 adults and a dozen children, all watching Karen's public breakdown with the fascination reserved for spectacular disasters. This was the woman who'd terrorized their neighborhood for years, finally revealing herself as completely unhinged. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for vandalism, reckless endangerment, and destruction of property," Detective Wong announced, approaching Karen with handcuffs. But Karen wasn't finished. As Wong reached for her arms, she broke away and ran toward my porch, screaming about illegal structures and community violations, while completely ignoring the fact that she'd just committed multiple felonies in front of 24 witnesses. That's when I delivered my mic drop moment. I walked calmly to my front door, retrieved the manila folder I'd been saving for exactly this occasion, and handed it to Detective Wong while Karen ranted in the background. "Detective, this folder contains 6 months of documented harassment, including evidence of embezzlement from the HOA treasury," I said loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. "Karen Delgado has stolen approximately $144,000 from her neighbors, while using her position to terrorize anyone who questioned her authority." The neighborhood went dead silent, except for the sound of steam escaping from the destroyed truck. 60 families had been paying HOA dues for 2 years, wondering why promised improvements never materialized. Now they knew their money had been funding Karen's personal lifestyle and legal campaigns. "That's a lie!" Karen shrieked, but her voice cracked with the desperation of someone whose last secret had just been exposed. "I earned that money. I worked for this community." Detective Wong was already calling for backup and white-collar crime specialists as neighbors began connecting the dots. The missing swimming pool, the canceled playground equipment, the delayed road repairs that never happened. Karen's war against my mailbox had just exposed her embezzlement of an entire neighborhood's trust fund. The aftermath unfolded like dominoes falling in slow motion, each consequence triggering the next until Karen's entire house of cards collapsed. The criminal charges came first: grand theft, embezzlement, harassment, animal cruelty, and vehicular assault. Karen's bail was set at $200,000, money she couldn't access because the court had frozen her assets pending investigation into the missing HOA funds. Her house went into foreclosure within 60 days. Her HOA presidency ended with a unanimous vote of no confidence, and her legal bills mounted faster than autumn leaves as she faced both criminal prosecution and civil lawsuits from 60 families demanding their stolen money back. But the most satisfying consequence was watching our neighborhood transform from a place ruled by fear into an actual community. Without Karen's iron grip, neighbors started talking to each other. Mrs. Elise organized potluck dinners that brought together families who'd been too scared to socialize before. Bob Martinez started a tool lending library in his garage. The Rodriguezes taught Spanish classes for kids whose parents worked long hours. My fortress mailbox became an unlikely neighborhood landmark. Visitors would stop to examine the steel post that had stopped a semi-truck, and I'd tell the story of standing up to a bully who thought authority meant terrorizing people into submission. "That mailbox saved our neighborhood," Mrs. Elise told the local newspaper reporter who came to document our story. "It proved that some things are worth defending, and some people won't back down." The insurance settlement from Karen's truck attack funded something beautiful: a community scholarship program for local kids pursuing education in trades, engineering, or public service. My grandfather would have loved knowing his memorial mailbox had become the foundation for helping young people build better futures. Napoleon the Rooster became a minor celebrity after multiple video appearances showing him chasing Karen during her various property invasions. The local coffee shop put his picture on their community board under the heading Neighborhood Hero, and kids would ask to meet the famous chicken protector. Karen pled guilty to avoid trial, accepting 18 months in prison plus full restitution to the HOA. She sold her house to pay back part of what she'd stolen, then disappeared to another state to rebuild her life somewhere nobody knew her history. The HOA dissolved itself rather than continue operating under the cloud of Karen's corruption. In its place, we formed a voluntary neighborhood association with no mandatory fees, no architectural control, and no authority beyond organizing block parties and maintaining the little park where kids ride bicycles. Property values actually increased after Karen left. Turns out that living in fear of your neighbors isn't great for real estate prices, while having a genuine community where people help each other is exactly what families want. I kept surveying, but now half my business comes from neighbors who trust me because they watched me document everything during the Karen Wars. "He's the guy who never backs down" became my unofficial marketing slogan, and it's been more effective than any advertising I ever paid for. The technical lessons from this experience became part of my professional workshops. Document everything, know your legal boundaries, And never let bullies convince you that their authority is legitimate just because they say it loudly enough. But the personal lessons run deeper. Sometimes the best defense is refusing to be defenseless. Sometimes standing up to one bully protects everyone around you. And sometimes an old mailbox can represent everything worth preserving about family, community, and the principle that some things are too important to surrender. Last month, a young couple moved into Karen's old house, a teacher and a mechanic who wanted a quiet neighborhood to raise their kids. Their first question was about the steel mailbox that survived the truck attack. "That's the story of how our neighborhood learned to fight back," I told them over coffee on my grandfather's porch. "And why you never have to be afraid of anyone who thinks they're in charge of your life." The autumn air carries the scent of apple pie from Mrs. Elise's kitchen, the sound of kids playing in the street without fear, and the promise that some communities are stronger after they've been tested.